remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the Cheeky Merchants. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you.
Hi, Cheeky Natives. Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky Natives. I feel like 2024 is the year of the Cheeky Natives. We have brought you fantastic guests from the beginning, and we're only continuing in that vein. I am so excited for today's conversation. The Tlokonolo, I feel like we just lost our minds reading this book, but we'll talk about it. The Tlokonolo, how are you?
I'm doing well. I remember saying to you, I'm reading the book, and you're like, I'm finished. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're finished already? I also just read the book in one sitting. It was that good. For me, it was just like, I even went back to reread it. It was gorgeous. I'm really, really excited about this conversation.
Our guest today is Omolola Ijeoma Ogunyemi, who was born and raised in Ibadan, Nigeria. She was a finalist for the 2009 Payne Stadzinki Literary Award, and her poetry and stories have appeared in New Writing from Africa, the Massachusetts Review, the Indiana Review, and the American Poetry Review. She's the professor of preventative and social medicine, where she teaches and conducts research on using biomedical information to reduce health disparities. She lives in Los Angeles with her husband and is the author of Jollof, Rice, and Other Revolutions. Congratulations and welcome, Omolola. We are so excited to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Jollof, Rice, and Other Revolutions. Omolola, the title of the book is very catchy, right? I picked it up and I was like, Jollof Rice, of course I love Jollof Rice. And what are these other revolutions, right? And we know that it's also kind of the title story of one of the stories in the book. But why the title? Why Jollof Rice and Other Revolutions?
So the original title for the collection was just the title story, Jollof, Rice, and Revolutions. But my editor wanted a title for the collection that was a little bit different from the title story. And so it became Jollof, Rice, and Other Revolutions. The original title was sort of tongue-in-cheek. You know, you have this uprising at a boarding school, and Jollof Rice sort of turns the tide in some ways and distracts people from their original goals. That was what I originally had in mind.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you said that, right? I love short stories. This collection of short stories is very different. This is a collection of short stories that are interlocking in a way that feels like a novel. So all the stories, as you read the book, you realize that all the stories are connected. The characters are connected. The choices they make impact each other. Why did you make this editorial choice instead of just writing a full-length novel?
Right. As you read, I'm an informatician full-time. I started writing this when I was an instructor and finished when I was a full professor. So it took 15 years to write. And so what I would do, so I'm writing grants, I'm writing, scientific papers, and I was able to write in chunks. I could write a story at a time, even though the same characters kept coming to me and I knew I was going to write about the same characters. But it was like, okay, I can bite off a story at, this point in time, send it out for publication, send it out to friends, send it out to people to read. And so that's kind of how I put together what I always knew would be a linked short story collection, but I never sat down and set out to write a traditional straight through novel.
So the book is told in the past, in the present, but also in the future. We start in the past and we end the collection in the future. But there seems to be a shift between the last few stories, right? Almost as if you were writing this at a different time in your life and the reflections was different. And we were quite interested in finding out the shift, right? So the oscillation from past, present, and future, but also the shifting texture of the stories.
It's funny because other people have mentioned this. And for me, the final story in particular, I was definitely in a different space. I wrote that story in 2018. Living and working as a Nigerian in the US at a time when it wasn't very clear that immigrants were kind of welcome in the US anymore. And so that definitely weighed on me when I was writing the last story. But I would also take a step back and say that there is a thread running through between the first and the last stories. And if you think about what it was like for someone who was used to a certain kind of life. So the first story, you have a woman trying to live her traditions. So she's not able to have a child, and her tradition allows her to marry another woman, pay a bride price, and to have a child that way. Then here comes another culture saying this is not acceptable. For her, it would have been a dystopian reality. It's like, this was my life, and now I can't live it the way. And so there was that thread running through. I didn't feel it was so far off from what Adalma in the first story went through.
I'm interested in the geography in this book. And the geography is particularly interesting because some parts take place in Nigeria, some parts are in Ibadan, some in Lagos. Some of the stories take place in the US as well. But the book feels anchored in Nigeria. Home is a constant theme that resonates throughout the book. As the geography consists of this tug between where you are physically located, but where you are emotionally or traditionally or culturally anchored. So I wanted to speak about what it meant to have anchored your stories in Nigeria, but have the characters physically in other parts of the world.
Yeah, so that was obviously a deliberate choice. I've lived most of my life outside of Nigeria, but my formative years were in Nigeria. Another thing I wanted to do within Nigeria was to showcase places that people don't necessarily see in books. Lagos always shows up, right? But I was born and raised in Ibadan. Ibadan doesn't always show up in stories and some of the smaller towns. So I tried to give a little bit of a taste of different parts of Nigeria as well. But it's also the story of migration. There's often this feeling of the grass is always greener. You're in the US and you start missing the sights, sounds, smells, and food from home. Then you go to visit Nigeria and you're like, oh, this is why I left in the first place. The traffic, this doesn't work, that doesn't work. That's part of the human condition. This grass is greener on the other side sensibility. I also wanted to showcase friendship. The story is anchored around this friendship between four friends who meet in boarding school. It's fiction, but it was inspired by my boarding school experiences. It was inspired by my mother's boarding school experiences as well. I've always marveled. One of her friends used to joke that she's had friends for 60, 70 years. They met in boarding school, and they say without the aid of Facebook or social media, they've kept in touch for decades and decades and maintained their friendship. So I also wanted some of that to come through.
I mean, we really love this book because the writing is amazing, but it also plays in different genres, right? So we get a sense of historical fiction, speculative fiction. We also get a sense of like feminist type of work in the collection. And we wanted to talk about why it was important for you to play with different genres, particularly in a short story collection, which seems like a novel, but is not a novel. What was the decision to dip your toes in these various genres?
So as you can tell from my training, I'm a computer scientist. One of the things I did when I knew I was going to seriously write was take writing classes. Part of that was write the story in the second person, write speculative fiction. So I took that as a challenge, especially the historical fiction. I really didn't think I could do that at all. I was most surprised to be able to pull that off. I saw it as a personal challenge to try to do things well and to tell stories in a way that I might not have thought I could, and see what other people thought, get feedback and refine and make it stronger as much as I could.
I mean, you did it brilliantly.
Thank you.
This book is a marvel.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm so in love with the friendships in this book. There is a way in which she writes about the friendship amongst the women who are all completely different. All different, have different backgrounds, but also have very different life experiences. And there is an ode to female friendship that you do in this book. I'm interested because I feel like you really wrote against the current of messy female friendships, of women who don't like each other, just like mean girls, right? There's a really solid friendship. And I think particularly what stands out is that even in death, they continue to be Solape's friend. They show up for Solape's family. They show up for her mother. There is a way in which the friendships in this book continue to save each other's lives. I'm curious about why friendship was such a central theme in this book, but why you chose to write friendship among women in the way that you did.
So one of the things I think is I've read a lot of stories with mean girls, and it can make for a more interesting reading, but that doesn't square with my experience long term. I mean, there's always friction in friendships, even in their friendships. I didn't dwell too much on that, but you do get a little sense of that. I've seen, especially in societies that are a man's world, friendships among women really help people to survive and thrive and move forward. That was part of what I wanted to shine through. I've seen it. I'm still in touch with friends from boarding school days, where we have a WhatsApp group and we keep in touch. I've already talked about my mother's friendships with people from her boarding school. I've had some people say it's not as interesting because everything seems perfect, but I'm hoping that some of the nuances, because it wasn't, like there was never conflict among the friendships, but there was the notion that they were each other's chosen family. And so they could survive and move past any of that. I just really wanted to put an ode to found families, the families that we create for ourselves. We're born into families. There's nothing we can do about the families that we're given, but we can pick our own families through our friends and shape that experience. I wanted to give a nod to that.
You're preaching. I'm just sitting here and I'm like, yes, found families, choosing families. I'm interested in the first story. I really loved the first story. I loved every story, and we'll talk about one of my favorite stories. But I loved the first story because I think it does really important work in thinking about the flexibility of Igbo gender construction, right? And also the separation between gender and what is assigned at birth. But I think what it also does, it begins to tell us about the political status of women in traditional Igbo societies and the political choices open to them, right? So I'm interested in the research that you undertook of the story, because we get introduced to a concept that exists in biology, sociology, and anthropological studies, which is this idea of female husbands. So I'm interested in the research of the story and why it was important for you to start this collection with that type of story. You make a commentary about the role of money, right? We know you're talking about the political status of women and the fact that if a woman is not able to give birth, she's relegated to a certain class of womanhood. But what money does in the story and in society is that it allows certain political choices that wouldn't be available for women who don't have money, right against the idea of the binary. So many people would think this of a queer story, but it's not actually a queer story. It's a story about gender. And that has nothing to do with sexuality or queerness in the way that people understand queerness. So I wanted your reflections on the story, about the research, but also commentary that you wanted to make in the story.
So there were many things going on with that story. One is that modern day Nigeria has banned same-sex marriages. And, Nigeria has become very much religious society with lots of preachers and imams. And you'll hear people saying, oh, that's a Western, that's not our culture. And I'm like, really? So yes, in the sense that some of these religious figures are thinking, maybe yes, but it felt like a lot of people were ignorant of the culture and of the fact that, yes, women in certain parts of Nigeria could marry other women if they essentially had the means. And that wasn't fair either for those who didn't, but it just allowed women to occupy a different kind of space. If you were able to prove yourself in certain ways, whether through trading or what have you, you could elevate yourself in society and essentially carve your own space, make your own way, and everybody would recognize that. I mean, one of the fascinating things about that tradition is that a woman is wealthy, she's able to marry another woman because she can't have a child. The woman she marries gets lovers, has a child, and the father of the child has no recognizable rights. That is, the whole society is like, you didn't pay a bride price, you have no say here, that's not your child. That was just fascinating to me, absolutely fascinating. But I could also see how the British would come and say, what is this craziness? No, we can't wrap our heads around this. This has to go. I did a reading in Lagos last year at bank. The bank had a book club and there were about 30 people at the reading, maybe 12 women, 18 men. I asked people, how many of you have heard of this tradition? Almost all the women's hands went up. And then I go, how many of you had never heard? Every single man's hand went up. They had never heard of this before. Many of the women had. I found that fascinating, like how information about culture gets passed on. I wanted to write this story because I found out as a teenager that my grandmother's older sister was married to a woman. And I was like, oh, wow. That's how I first heard about this tradition. This is fascinating because nobody really talks about this anymore. So I really wanted to explore that.
We're taking a short break.
I think that's a good way for us to segue into something that was an interesting theme in the book. Nonso's experience of infertility is the second such that we see in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
We Ada have the experience of being unable to have children, and we see Nonso, right? These are both very successful women in different spheres, right? So there's a profound grief that both these women experience, and we struggle to name it because these are women who are successful, well partnered, right? But there is a profound grief that both these women experience. And I wanted to talk about why this was a theme that was important to carry for two major characters in the book. We see it at the beginning in where you write against the binary, but also in Nonso and Dwayne's experience, and Nonso having to reimagine what it will look like to have a family outside of the constraints of the nuclear. So outside of the constraints of mother, father, 2.4 children and a puppy. This is what it looks like. And I found that interesting, the iteration of this grief and childlessness that carries throughout two of these major characters. So I wanted to talk about why it was important for you to bring this theme to the fore in the way that you did in two different time periods as well.
So I wanted to explore how women in different time periods would handle a similar situation. Nonso ends up in a kind of situation where she has a child placed in her arms and she could take the path that her step grandmother did, but she makes a choice not to. It's this in the same society. There's still till today a lot of emphasis on fertility in women and your worth essentially revolving around your ability to have children. Pushing back against that a little bit, what does it mean if you can't conform to that standard? And how would different women at different periods in time handle that? How would they deal with it? Ijeoma handles it in one way and finally comes to terms with the fact that children don't have to be adopted in the way that Ijeoma did or biological. She and her husband decide to have these leadership schools and essentially adopt thousands of children across the diaspora. So that's how they choose to handle that particular situation. But yeah, the grief is real for both women. They don't both have means, and so they handle it in interesting ways using the means that they have.
I think that grief of childlessness is important, but I think there are also several times of grief in the book.
Right.
It's interesting. I love reading about grief. We see the death of a friend quite early on in the book, and that death is a little tragic, right? But we also see that death is connected to the death of a daughter. So this mom loses the only daughter that she has, right? And I think there is something that you do there about mother and their daughters, because we know in the story of Solape's mom, she reflects on the fact that the father will always have his sons, but she can't have the daughter. And we think about the grief of divorce, right? So later in the book, there's the grief of things not working out and the grief of actually losing a husband. Also thinking about the importance of holding space for parents who have lost their children and not forgetting about them. We've spoken about this friendship that goes past the death and these girls who have just come and still support. I wanted to speak about those various types of grief.
One of the things that the friendship is able to do for Solape's mom is help her grieve in a way that her friends, husband, and possibly her kids won't. Her grief is uncontrollable, and they want her manifestation of it to be contained, to be controlled. And what the other girls give her a space to do is explore the fact that her daughter was a fully fledged human being. She wasn't a saint, but she was a worthy friend, worthy of being loved and very much loved by her friends. And it just gives her a space to feel that her daughter's life was meaningful and worth something, because here are these three girls who keep coming back. Like, we haven't forgotten, and we're going to keep talking about what she meant to us and how we move forward with that. And that's, I think, for any parent, it doesn't take away the grief, but it sort of cements the idea that your child's life meant something to multiple people. There's a good feeling in that, so there's grief, but there's also, okay, there was something good here that went outside of your family and touched other people. Aisha deals with, I think she's meant to have the most sort of maladjusted reaction to what happens to Solape. And so in her marriage to Andrew, even from the get-go, she kind of knows she shouldn't marry him. She kind of knows she shouldn't. But here's somebody who in some ways understands her better than she understands herself. So she's thinking, okay, maybe that's the way I need to go. And then as she grows and realizes more about who she is and where she should be, she's like, yeah, that was not the right choice for me. And so she meets Ade, and it's truly a love match. But then he's taken away in different circumstances, but they are together for a very long time. And so the other grief that I was exploring there, so there's a loss of a husband through divorce, there's a loss of a husband through death, but there's also a loss of a friendship and some of your idealism.
Yeah.
Because part of her grief, she's the one from the wealthiest background. Writing this in the US, people kept talking about, oh, these are wealthy kids. I was trying to get people to understand that at the time this is set, the Naira and the dollar were 1-to-1. These are middle-class girls, except for Aisha. Aisha is wealthy. And with that wealth comes a certain kind of power. She feels she could have done more to prevent what happened to Solape. She carries that extra burden and lets it go a little too far. Her decision to be a lawyer is because Solape wanted to be a lawyer. She goes a little bit overboard with that. But then in the end, she's able to sort of reconnect with her estranged child and sort of have a different vision, because she's sort of looking at life with jaundiced eyes. She's lost her husband. Her kids are not exactly where she had hoped that they would be. But in a way, what happens in the end gives her a chance at redemption in her own eyes. How other people view it might be a little bit different, but it gives her a second chance in her own eyes.
Aisha's relationships with her children are interesting. But we've spoken about grief, and I think it would be remiss to not speak about the grief of watching your children turn out in ways that you didn't expect or that you had not hoped for. A big part of parenting is also about the dreams that we have for our children and the kind of hopes and aspirations that we see. To watch your daughter regress in real time from the feminist ideals, from all of these things that you had seen is a very particular kind of grief. I think we don't hold enough space for the idea that even parents grieve the kind of dreams that they had for their children, the kind of hopes and aspirations. And I think that relationship is a particularly interesting one, right? Her daughter goes in the completely opposite direction to anything Aisha and her friends would have done. Aisha and her friends are classed in very particular ways. They're also educated in very particular ways and have very particular ambitions. You think about the things Nonso has been able to do, or Remi goes to the US and makes something of herself in very difficult conditions. And her daughter really goes against the grain, and so does her granddaughter. And I think we need to explore why you wrote that story in the way that you did, right?
It's sort of that tension of sometimes wanting a child to be a mini clone of yourself, but also knowing that you need to, so you're raising someone who can be independent and make their own choices, even if those choices don't align with your vision, and to trust that they will still be okay. It doesn't have to be a rejection of you. This is a full-fledged human being making their life decisions, and it can work out for them and they can be happy in a way that you might not be. but, sort of coming to terms with that. And it takes Aisha a very long time to come to terms with that. At the end, she does.
I wanted to speak a little bit about the diasporic relationship with home. We think of Nonso's conceptualization of home and the reality of the people who live there. I particularly like the picturesque ways in which you painted Nonso's navigation of Nigeria. I don't like to call it code switching, but we know it is. In many ways, it's kind of like reading the room and be like, in this room, I need to show up in a particular way. And, what kind of dreams we have to do in order to make home, right, when we've left them? Because we know that Nonso ultimately is like, I can't do this US thing. I need to go back home. But we also know that there is a scene where she's like, Dwayne, I can't do this. I need to leave. Nigeria's turning me into this. I'm busy fighting taxi drivers. And I wanted to speak about that, right? Kind of this conceptualization of home, particularly for people who migrate and move a lot, for better opportunities, for better education, for, let's call it, goodness and greener pastures, right? But also the idea of having to not forget home. So when you are forming back into it, you become the person who exists in it. So you navigate the streets in the same way that you would as if you were always living there.
In some ways, so Nonso goes back and makes a decision not to immediately return, and sort of navigates that minibus ride. For her is a revelation, because she's sheltered. That's the first time not taking a car with a driver, with her family, just experiencing Nigeria in a different way. She's contrasting this with her life in the US and sort of finding some things about her life in the US wanting. Clearly can see that there are things in the Nigerian situation that are not ideal, but still finds that intriguing. Like, what would it be like to live here? And then she starts to live there. And so we get to see her experience essentially through blessings. A blessing works for her and thinks she's absolutely insane, at least initially. And part of the thing is that Nonso has like an exaggerated, she's lived in the US. So some of the casual sexism that people gloss over, she's not going to. But then her reaction is extreme and outrageous. I thought it was fascinating in its own right, because I've actually seen this with friends who move back and are kind of like, wow, okay, I need to stand up for myself in a way that I probably wouldn't in the US. I need to put a marker down that this is not acceptable. And then it's like, okay, kind of seems like I've lost my mind here. I need to find my way back. So yeah, there's definitely the code switching in the sense of, okay, I'm going to switch to Pidgin English. I'm going to take on this guy who's wronged me in some way. But then when the tables are turned and the area boys come in, it's like, okay, she's not that hard. She's not gonna. She realizes, okay, this is not who I am. I don't want this to go any further, and this is insane. It's just kind of interesting where the line is for different people, and it makes her realize, okay, I like Nigeria. I like living here to some extent, but there's just some things, yeah, that don't sit well with me.
I just want to say that the area boy story is, I mean, I love the book, but there's something so quintessentially Nigerian about that story. The story also does something really important, which is this kind of casual sexism. Blessing is taken advantage of by the first family that she's. Right. Yes, we can think of it as being consensual, but we have to think about the power dynamics that exist in a situation like that, right? And then for the wife to call Nonso to be like, oh, you better be careful. You're going to steal your man. And for Nonso to confront that and be like, but why are you not talking to your husband? Because your husband is the one who stepped out of line, right?
Exactly.
I think you were making a really important commentary about co-conspiratorship, because Nonso was speaking for Blessings in a phase where Blessing would not have been able to speak for herself because of her class, because of her race, because of just her educational background. But Nonso was saying, hold up, you can't blame Blessing for something your man did. Like, and I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? This idea of co-conspiratorship in the real sense, right? So not allyship as we understand it, by actually someone getting into the ring, right? And committing the crime with you effectively.
Yeah. So for me, it was very important to do this because that story, unfortunately, is a common story. In a place where labor is cheap, people don't necessarily get the education that they would like. It's very easy for, especially young women, to find themselves in situations where they're exploited. Sometimes the tables are turned and the servant girl becomes the madame. The old wife is turfed out, the new wife becomes, yeah. So that happens. In many cases, the girls get exploited and they also get blamed for their own exploitation. Society essentially is never on their side. And so I wanted Nonso to, so Nonso is coming back with this particular sort of Americanized eye in a way. And she's like, no, I'm not going to play along with that. Which is the other reason why Blessing thinks she's crazy, because there's very few women that are going to take on somebody of the same sort of class and social standing on behalf of a Blessing.
The violence in this book, I know Natokonolo has spoken about the area boys, but I'm very interested in the state-sponsored violence in this book because we see it in different situations, right? At the beginning of the book, there's this seminal event where the girls are at boarding school, there's an uprising, and Solape then loses her life because of that. But then you see Segun go into the US, right, and experience a kind of political violence that, of course, is meted out by the American police towards Black people and Black men. But seeing the violence of policing in the different locations is very interesting. Nigeria, and you think about colonial hangovers, and you think about this repressive state that almost moves in silence, but you see state-sponsored violence in the US in very overt ways. Police are going to stop and frisk you, or they're going to harass you. I'm curious about why you wrote about state-sponsored violence in different situations. It would have been easy to just write about the police in the US because that is a global phenomenon that's well known. But to have written violence in Nigeria in the way that you did is interesting because there's a commentary around state-sponsored violence that I think we sometimes as Africans want to gloss over. Right. When in actual fact, these are the remnants of colonialism, but also of the repressive states that sometimes we live in. So can we talk about the parallel between the two experiences and why Segun has to experience it in both contexts? I find that very interesting.
When we look at the Nigerian police force, what ends up being the police force in Nigeria starts out as a tool for colonial power to keep the population in check. The colonial power goes away, but some of those dynamics don't change. Their mentality doesn't suddenly change to protect and serve because the relationship is one of dominance and suppression. Even if the original folks who put that in place are gone, that legacy is still there. Then you come to the US and a lot of the policing roots are slave patrols. Again, policing Black bodies. A lot of the police force started out with patrols trying to bring back escaped enslaved people to the South and so on. That legacy continues. And Segun is a unique character in that his heritage includes a returnee from Brazil. So his great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather was captured in Nigeria, enslaved in Brazil, but returns after slavery is abolished there. So I wanted to speak to this duality that he has. And that was one of the ways of exploring that. His connection to the Americas through his heritage, but also through this notion of policing. Coming together, it seems very different in modern times, but the roots of hostility to Black bodies is the same, even when the people doing it look just like you.
You do so much work in this book, and it's just absolutely brilliant. I'm just like, oh, we've spoken about kind of a little bit daughters and their mothers, but we haven't spoken about like kind of daughters and their fathers. We know Remi's experience with her absent father. There is an exchange in the book that I think was particularly jarring for the intersection of a lifetime of disappointment and displeasure. Can we talk about the relationship between the two as a proxy for difficult father-daughter relationships and the inability to blend? Because the father is like, yeah, but your stepfather was always there. as if it's okay, right? Like I didn't show up because some man showed up who doesn't have any biological ties to you. But now that we're all grown and you up in the US living it up, I'm going to call you and be like, don't forget my children who I'm fathering. They need money, right? They need money. It is kind of hard to sit and be like, whoa, so you chose to not be present because you believed that there was someone there who was present.
But not only that, it's also particularly gendered, right? So Remi's half sibling is a son, right? And it would be remiss not to highlight the fact that her father behaves in very particular ways because this is his son. So the daughter is held to the expectation that she needs to be high achieving, she needs to do well in school, but the son can just exist. And because he exists, he's worthy of the admiration of his father in ways that your daughter is not. And that's very gendered. To pretend that he just does that because she has her stepfather is not true. There is the fact that this is his son. And the fact that this man's son holds a lot of weight as opposed to the fact that it's Remi. Remi is the daughter, and so by existence, she should look after her father. Whereas the son is held up in high esteem. That relationship was fraught, not only because she had her stepfather, she may have not had the stepfather, he would have felt the same. I'm really curious about the gender. In addition to your question, the gender of this dynamic is striking for me.
If we did a thought experiment and Remi was a boy, would her father stay away because there's a stepfather in the picture? I think the answer is no. I was trying to explore a number of things with that particular relationship dynamic. From my perspective, Remi's father just doesn't know how to handle that separation. He doesn't handle the divorce well. The stepfather being in the picture is an excuse. However, he loves his daughter. There's this dynamic I've talked about with friends where we come from backgrounds where parents don't necessarily say, oh, I love you. They tell you, I'm showing it to you. I paid your school fees. You have a roof over your head. Like, these are the ways I'm showing you these things. And you should immediately understand that. What Remi is getting at is it enough to just pay my school fees and show up for my graduation, but not be there for the moments that really matter? My friend died. You don't even know who she was. This was a major thing that happened in my life, and you're not even aware. But you think, okay, I paid her school fees. I did this. I demonstrated things in this way. That buys me loyalty and love. She's like, no, I'm not going to play along with this anymore, especially seeing how her younger brother is able to get away with things that she could never dream of. It's not atypical in Nigerian culture where boys are allowed to do things that girls couldn't dream of getting away with. Remi's father loves Remi. It's just the way he demonstrates it is not ideal, to say the least.
And I suppose it is also about Remi's lifetime of disappointment that's important, because that scene in the book makes her reflect deeply about actually something's not right. You saying that my stepfather wasn't there is also not right, because it's about so much deeper than that. I like that moment of reckoning for Remi to be like, now I need to speak up and I need to say, actually, you know what? I can't help you. Because if the roles were reversed, if he had to do this, he probably would have been like, I'm taking care of my family. And that would have been the end of the matter.
I think the last story in this book is just different. The cadence is absolutely different from the rest of the story. It's quite alarming. The rest of the book is in some ways nostalgic, the social commentary, but this in particular is very different. It's a dystopian imagining of the future that is very alarming. So there's a religious and ideological regression that you describe in Nigeria, but there's also a political and racial regression in the US that takes place at the same time. These stories run in parallel, and it's interesting to witness because you see Aisha's daughters do interesting things. You see, it happens in one family, the contrast becomes so clear, right? The contrast in geography and locations. And then you see Okri's experience with Andrew in the US. I wanted to speak about why there is this shift in the very last story. There's a shift but also another difficult parental relationship she writes about in this part of the book, right? So Aisha and Okri's relationship is fraught with misunderstanding. There's miscommunication, but there's a part that Aisha plays in this rift as well that I'd want us to speak about.
When I was writing the last story, I started writing it in 2018. There was a different mindset and a certain fear about what was going on in the US. I actually conceived of the first and last stories as bookends to each other.
Mm.
In other words, I felt that if you were sitting in 1897, what happened is dystopian. The fact that we're looking back on it and we've already changed does not make that for an Adalma, what happened to her is as devastating as what happens to Aisha or the way things progress for her in the future. So I saw them as bookends, but I know that not everybody will feel the same way. One of the things, I was trying to explore a lot of things, obviously, the sort of hostility to immigrants and immigration in the US, and the ways in which in Nigeria, religion seems to have encroached in every sphere of life, almost to the point where people, there are things that you can do for yourself or for society, but then it's like, well, what's the point? If we're all going to heaven. Like, we don't have to worry about this particular, this plane. And I'm like, that's a tricky place to get to, because that doesn't bode well for society in the future. So I wanted to explore that. And that has been the story that has gotten me a lot of pushback in Nigeria, because people are frank. I wouldn't change anything about what I wrote. So exploring some of the dynamics in the US as well. Unfortunately, some of that is still looming, potentially, because we have a matchup between two people. 2020 worked out one way, don't know how things will work out in 2024. Outlook that blames everything on immigration and tries to use xenophobia and immigrants as the source of all ills in society. And it's easy to whip up people, rally them around that, and not have them see, this person's not doing anything for me. There's nothing about their policies that would make my life better. They've just found me a scapegoat. I found that scary in 2018. I still find it scary now. So I think that story, unfortunately, is still timely. And I was hoping we would be past that, but we're not.
And I think also more timely in the context of the anti-gender, anti-rights movement that's creeping up in all parts of Africa, right? We've seen what's happening in Ghana. We see what's potentially happening in Kenya, in Zambia. And so it is timely in a sense that there is a regression, and the regression is fueled by this kind of religious, ideological regression and movement, right? So it is timely. But I suppose, we are a little bit less optimistic about the future than some people. And maybe that's why we've enjoyed the story in the way that we have, because we're saying, actually, it's urgent now.
Aisha Okri, guys, I just need to understand what happened. I'll say why. I think Aisha and Okri so Aisha then has the experience of blending this family, right? She has another child, and Okri is difficult. So Aisha isn't really sad. There's a part of her that is okay with Okri going to his father. And for a mother to almost say she's okay with that is almost criminal, right? There would be people who would not want the admission of that. But this was a really difficult relationship, more difficult than the relationship she had with her daughter, who is so different to her. And I'm struck by his illness and her subsequent intervention. That challenges, what are the boundaries of a mother's life? What would you do even for your estranged child? And I think it's such a beautiful way for the story to end, right? The way in which Aisha's love transcends even the difficult relationship that they have. And I wanted us to speak a little bit to that.
Yeah. So from Okri's perspective, most people want their parents to stay together, no matter what is going on with the parents. Like a kid doesn't necessarily get the nuances of a relationship or how you married this person because they made you feel a certain way, and you later realized, well, this isn't really right for me. And so from Okri's perspective, his mother made a selfish choice. Interestingly, from Aisha's perspective, Aisha feels a certain guilt because there's a point where she's like, it might be easier this way. That is what drives her need to make amends in the end. Deep down, she knows that there are choices that she made that, weren't really considering, Okri's well-being at the time that she made them. She was trying to live for herself. We make some decisions in life that are a little bit selfish. And when there are consequences, how do we deal with it? She decides to show up in a certain way and be the mother she hasn't been to him in a very long time. But there's also the thing of, Okri exploring. Okri comes from two different worlds, and he doesn't quite feel he fits in either. And she doesn't seem to understand that or show an appreciation for that. So there's also something a little selfish and missing in Aisha's worldview as it comes to Okri that doesn't exist. So for her daughter, it's just, oh, I would have liked her to be, more like me. But for him, she's not completely grasping the reality he has to live with and move through. In a way, her husband who passes away gets it more than she does and intervenes a little when Okri makes his decision. It takes Aisha a long time to finally get to the point where it's like, okay, I have to step up and be present in this particular way to make amends, whether or not Okri wants that. This is something she's going to do for him and for herself.
The final question before we sign out is to think about, what does rest look like for Black women? Because this book is a great oath to thinking about the interior lives of Black women. But ultimately, I think that it does ask us questions to reflect on. And I think one of the major questions is, what does rest look like for Black women?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of rest for Black women, given the political, the cultural, and you hear people say, I'm tired, I'm weary, but they can't just rest. They can't just be, because there's too much to do. There's too much that still needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that we get to a place and time where there is rest and relaxation for Black women, because the Friends find that they're able to carve moments for themselves. So even in the sort of dystopia of that time, when they get together, even in their 70s, for a while, they can sort of forget everything and almost regress to their childhood and have that banter. But then again, life intrudes. So what they do for themselves is bring that feeling of family and camaraderie and the ability to just be. No airs, no trying to impress anybody. This is your found family, and you can just be. And in each other's presence, they can do that for a while, but life intrudes as it often does.
Yeah.
Oh, that's such a beautiful way to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Omolola. I think you can tell that Ogunyemi and I absolutely loved this book. We thought really deeply about so many of the themes, and I think it was in many ways just the kind of book that we needed to read. I think it's powerful that you were able to do that with short stories. So from the Cheeky Natives, congratulations. Thank you. We cannot wait to see what else you do in the future. This was absolutely, the Ogunyemi and I were just losing it every time we were talking about this book. I'd be like, are you done yet? Are you done? Let's talk about it. I think that's just the kind of book that you've written.
I even got the audiobook.
An immersive experience.
I had a whole immersive experience. I've listened
to
it
yeah, because it's a
like
pigeon.
6 times. I'm just like, yes, bless, tell it. So again, thank you very much for what is a wonderful collection of stories, but also a collection of stories that makes us think differently about the interior lives of Black women throughout history and possibly in the future. From the Cheeky Natives, our deepest gratitude. And as Alma said, we cannot wait to have you back for whatever other book is going to be coming. We're just going to give ourselves a standing invite to speak about all the work that you will produce.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your inviting me. I really enjoyed this. I am working on another book, but it'll be a while because I have this other career as well.
The truth of the matter is you're a superstar. You gotta be a superstar in STEM before you do this other thing called writing.
Just not 15 years, Omolola. Just not.
It won't be that. I think my agent would kill me. Again.
I just want to say to the Cheeky Natives, please definitely get Jollof Rice and Other Revolutions. I've literally, from my Instagram post, made a book club, buy the copies of Jollof Rice and Other Revolutions for their read in April. So I'm just going to be Jollof Rice, and I know Alma's going to do the same, because we think that this collection of short stories everybody must have in their bookshelf or their library.
Thank you. Really appreciate that.
Bye, Cheeky Natives.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cheeky Natives. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.